Welcome to the IISS. My name is Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow here and editor of our journal Survival. And pleased to welcome, as part of our discussion on war, power, our discussion series on war, power, and rules, Professor Bruce Jentleson, who is professor of public policy and political science at Duke University, has had a long list of illustrious positions in scholarship and in the United States government, including 2 stints at the State Department Policy Planning staff. He worked as senior advisor to Vice President Al Gore's presidential campaign, and then worked on the national security team in the Obama presidential campaign. He's also had resident and non-resident positions at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, the John Klug Center at the Library of Congress, where he was a Henry Kissinger scholar, and lots more. I might add, as an example of channels of influence, one of his earliest, if not his earliest book, was Pipeline Politics, the Complex Political Economy of East-West Energy Trade, which I relied on quite heavily for one chapter of my PhD dissertation and first book, which was just a few years ago. But in any event, his latest book is The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship. And I suppose this is not quite a Marxist materialist view of human history. I'll just read from John Eikenberry's Foreign Affairs Review. Great man accounts of history have long been out of favor with scholars of international relations, but Jentleson reminds readers that leaders do matter. He looks across the 20th century to identify 15 transformational people who bent the flow of politics in the direction of peace and reconciliation. These include Zhou Enlai, Henry Kissinger, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Mahatma Gandhi, Lech Walesa, and Aung San Suu Kyi. This is an old-fashioned book in a certain way, but maybe you'll tell us why it's not old-fashioned.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Dana, and thanks to Corey for the invitation. It's great to be here. Back in 2007, when I was doing a sabbatical at Oxford, I was actually a visiting senior research fellow here as well. And I remember that because in those days I'd take the bus in from Oxford, and the big innovation those days, we could actually have wireless on the bus, so like you could read your New York Times in the morning. You know, it's like really new and cool, and now it's ho-hum, right, to have that sort of thing. But in any event, I'm in town, London, and giving a series of talks related to the book, and so I really appreciate the invitation to be here. I want to make a couple of comments about sort of the way I intended this book at the beginning, give you a little bit of flavor for it, and then really maximize the time to take questions and discussion. 3 points really about the book at the outset. One is I wrote this as sort of what I think of as the 2 cheers for diplomacy. I think we live in an era, I think it's really true in the United States, where for a variety of reasons, we can name lots of generals that are famous, whether you agree or disagree with them, you know their names over the last 20, 25 years. But when you ask students or general public to name significant diplomats, maybe they come out with Dick Holbrooke, maybe they go back to Kissinger. And I think we live in an era in which we have, started to underappreciate the role that diplomacy and statesmanship can play, not only on a day-to-day basis, but on major breakthroughs that can have transformative effects on crucial issues. And I say 2 cheers, not 3 cheers, because I think oftentimes, to be critical on the other side, folks that advocate diplomacy are more about process than strategy. Well, let's just talk and have diplomacy, and hey, it's better than nothing. And that's not really a good criteria to do that. You really have to think about statesmanship as strategy, and I try to show that in a variety of ways in this book. Second point at the outset is this is not strictly a Trump reactive or Trump-centric book. I actually was working on it before the Trump administration. Let me just read you a quick section from the preface along those lines. The purpose of the book, as I say here, is what can we learn from 20th century statesmanship for the 21st century? It's not just to tell the stories, but to draw the lessons. But for a while in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it seemed like the world was going in a positive direction. Cold War was ending peacefully, dictatorships were falling to democracy, globalization appeared to be spreading the wealth, history was said to be over, with world affairs so harmonious as to be downright boring. Yet the end of the Cold War has not meant the end of war. U.S. relations with both Russia and China have grown tense and tenuous. That democratic wave has broken up on some rocky shores. Globalization has had losers as well as winners. History's come roaring back. Its ancient hatreds fueled by modern venom. Climate change is speeding up. Global health pandemics are spreading. Cyber and other emerging technologies are in need of rules of the game but aren't getting them. Indeed, it's a lot easier to name a global problem that's been growing worse than one on which progress is being made. This was my thinking even before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. All along, I've intended this book to draw lessons from 20th century statesmanship to help shape and motivate the peace and security breakthroughs our 21st century so crucially needs. Trump, as I come back to the epilogue, has made this all the more urgent. Others, such as Vladimir Putin, do as well. And along the lines that Dana said, I open the book with an epigram from Isaiah Berlin, which is always a good idea if you're writing a book to find something in Isaiah Berlin that you think works for you. And it was at crucial moments, at turning points, individuals and their decisions and acts can determine the course of history. So it's not going back to a great man theory of history. But those of you who've been through PhD programs in international relations, political science, know that's sort of, pounded out of you. It's all about systems and structures and models and, crucial concepts like national interest and balance of power. And much of international relations operates like that. And when you spend time in the Beltway, it's like all about personality, right? So there's a middle ground in between. And Isaiah Berlin's notion is that at crucial moments, leadership and leaders are really crucial, really make a difference. And the notion, you ask the question, as I do in this book, would a different leader in this situation made the same choices, been able to carry them out? And for every leader that I include in the book, I come to an answer of no. I frame this as what I call the 3 C's: constraints, conducive conditions, choices. Any leader, somebody in the business world or in higher ed or any sector, often faces constraints on major change. And at times you have conducive conditions. But rarely are either one of those determinative. And that's where it comes into the domain of choices that leaders make. And so I don't ignore that, nor do I ignore others that come into the stories. There's a chapter on Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, and of course Pope John Paul II comes in, as does Valencia, as does the Pugwash conferences that go back to the late 50s, early 60s, as does Ronald Reagan. But I try to make the focal point individual leaders in that regard. It's tricky to study leadership. If you go on Amazon, you get 191,637 books with the word leadership in them, and political leadership is a subset in the 60,000. But I try to come up with a framework. And I wrote this book, by the way, too, different than other things that we often do. I often do, many of you in this room often do. I wrote it for a very broad audience. So I've done a C-SPAN book world back in the States, and I've spoken at bookstores. And, given the general concern with the world today, you want to have people thinking about this, to have book clubs in a living room that say, who would you think about to be in a book about 20th century great leaders, or what would be the lessons you draw out? And so it obviously relates to a policy audience, but it has the broader sense. 2 other points. I cast a very wide net. My notion of statesmanship goes by the criteria of what I call impact had, not position held. So I actually include in the book not only leaders of nation states and foreign ministers and secretaries of state and leaders of international institutions, but some examples of bottom-up individuals from civil society, and I'll quickly run through some of those in a second. Partly because I think they made a difference in ways that civil society can help make breakthroughs in peace. And probably because I think when we look at the 21st century, those aspects are even more important than they were in the 20th century. I'm not into the nation state is over. Nation states really drive, the path of international relations. But there is a role for NGOs and others, perhaps to a greater extent than other periods in history. What do I mean by peace? Well, I don't mean full and perfect peace. That would have been like a really short and thin book. Would have been done with it a long time ago. But I do mean major breakthroughs on intractable conflicts that seemed intractable, that opened the way for other progress. And that the kind of things that we retrospectively sometimes look back on and say, well, of course that happened. But if you'd gone to Ladbrokes before Kissinger and Zhou Enlai met, you could have gotten pretty good odds about there being not a breakthrough in U.S.-China relations. Same with the notion, I can't tell you how many lectures I gave on the low likelihood that there'd be a peaceful end to the Cold War, right? And I confess, right? Unfortunately, we didn't have Twitter in those days for people to tweet them out. And then in terms of what I mean by peace, I break this down into 5 component dimensions. Major power relations. Since historically, religion of the major powers has always been a crucial factor in war and a crucial element in peace. Building international institutions, which I really particularly focus on the evolution of the UN as a significant institution. Third is reconciling politics of identity, those conflicts that have been about who I am and who you are, and why those are reasons for me to kill you and your group before you kill mine. Fourth is advancing freedom and human rights, and fifth is promoting global sustainability, dealing particularly with climate change and the risks of global health pandemics. Probably a section you wouldn't have had in a book 50 years ago, but I think when you think about the destructive power of, we all talk about WMD, the destructive power of EMD, environmental mass destruction, or DMD, diseases of mass destruction, you kind of get up there, maybe not with nuclear, but maybe with chemical and biological weapons. So in those, and then the other caveats are, none of these are perfect people. Nelson Mandela's in the book, wasn't a perfect person, didn't have a particularly good relation with their own children. In 1962, Amnesty International refused to adopt him as a prisoner of conscience because he was part of the Spear of the Nation, which was a violent movement. Gandhi's in the book. That's some odd personal habit, shall we say. But that's sort of the point, and a lot of these leaders are not necessarily people, when I draw the lessons of the 21st century, I'm not running around pointing to individuals. It's really about strategies for breakthrough leadership in each of these 5 areas. Because a lot of these people you wouldn't have necessarily recognized as having that potential earlier in their careers. And it's about particular policies, not their overall record. And that'll become evident in a couple of cases I give you. So let me just tell you who's included, and then I may, in the interest of time, maybe 2 or possibly 3 examples just to show you, how I go about it and try to draw out the lessons. So in the major power rivalry section, 1 chapter is on Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, the U.S.-China opening, which for really almost a half a century now has structured U.S.-China relations, all our theories about rising powers and Thucydides and all that sort of thing, used and misused, shall we say. Right? You've written on this. But I think has really structured the relationship in ways that didn't guarantee a perfect relationship, but were a crucial breakthrough there. And that's one of the cases I think I'll use as an illustration. Second one in that section is Gorbachev and the end of the Cold War. And at the end of each section, you can't really see it, but in a very clever publishing way, my publisher, W.W. Norton, has these gray pages. So at the end, after those 2 chapters, there's a section which is, okay, what are the lessons here for 21st century major power relations? For U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia, here Trump actually does come in, Trump-Putin, Trump-Xi. I was asked to write, I wrote a piece for foreign policy before the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. What were the lessons of this for the prospects of those summits and the like? In the second section, I have chapters on building international institutions. There's a chapter on Wilson and FDR, both the failure of the League and FDR's design of the UN. And another confession, I realized in this research that I've been teaching Woodrow Wilson wrong all these years, right? Oh, poor Woodrow Wilson, he had these ideas, and he comes home, and there's this isolationist wave, And when you actually get down into it, and you read the biographies and the Wilson papers, the guy was incredibly arrogant. And there were deals, suffice to say, there were deals to be had in the League of Nations with senators, both Republican and Democrat, not necessarily Henry Cabot Lodge, that would have not, totally undercut the League, but would have compromised and could have led to approval of the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, and the U.S. Senate. We don't know, the League may still not have succeeded, but we know that a crucial reason it didn't was the lack of U.S. membership. And so the Wilson story really is about his failures, really, in that aspect of being transformational. And Roosevelt particularly focusing on his role and his vision for the UN. But the main chapter in that section is on Dag Hammarskjöld, who in my view was the most successful, far and away, Secretary General of the UN ever had. And his Secretary Generalship has some real lessons for the 21st century. And I'll come back to that one in a second, too. The Reconciling Politics of Identity, there's a chapter on Mandela. And again, it's important to remember how unusual it was that somebody who spent 27 years as a political prisoner opted for reconciliation, not retribution. And how extraordinary it was that he won over the Afrikaner population sufficiently to make the transition and the steps he made. He wasn't that particularly effective as president, but it's really about his role in that transformation. And South Africa has enormous problems, but this is really about the capacity to achieve a democratic, peaceful transformation. A chapter on Yitzhak Rabin, which I call Soldier as Peacemaker, which also talks about his role, where some of his failings were, in my view, why he was very much on the right track, and arguments to that effect. And then a chapter it's a little different that goes back to the civil society, and it focuses on the Northern Ireland Women for Peace, and the role of Mayreed Corrigan and Betty Williams, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in 77, I believe, or 76. Two everyday people who responded to the violence. The troubles had been ratcheting up, the levels of violence in those years. I was actually a graduate student at the LSE around then. I remember bombings at Harrods and the like, but in Belfast. And had an effect in terms of setting off a civil society peace movement that didn't solve the problems. It would be another 20 plus years to the Good Friday Agreement when problems remain. But the levels of violence never went up to the same levels. And their role in the Northern Ireland Women for Peace really brought the violence down. And it's an interesting story, not obviously the same level as Rabin or Mandela, but that has its significance for them. The section on advancing freedom and protecting human rights operates from the notion that there are four key issues in the 20th century: anti-colonialism, ending Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, ending military dictatorships, and advancing human rights. And so there's one chapter on each. The anti-colonialism is on Gandhi. The ending Soviet domination is on Lech Walesa. Actually, I had a chapter on Havel too, because they went about it in different ways, but had to cut some chapters for, business model of the book, that sort of thing. And I just thought Walesa sort of fit better. And then the chapter on ending military dictatorships, as Dana said in the review, is on Aung San Suu Kyi. And the title of that chapter is A Cautionary Tale. And I started writing that a few years back about the role she played from 1989 to 2013-15. And we're finishing the book last summer, and the Rohingya genocide is occurring, in which, at minimum, most people think she's been complicit. I had a conversation with my editor, and I said, we need to take this chapter out. And he said, let's talk about this. He said, the whole purpose of the book, and all these chapters you're trying to learn from successes and failures, and where certain leadership skills help with certain key objectives for peacemaking, and where they failed people in others. I mean, a smaller scale, Walesa was a terrible president of Poland. Nobody ever thought Gandhi, had he lived, would have been a prime minister of India, right? His role was... And he said, we need to write it in a way that is a cautionary tale, that actually speaks to this tendency in the outside world to both idealize and demonize. And that's what we did in the chapter, and really talk about what one can learn from both. I've had people say, how could you even have her in a book on peacemakers? Fair point. But this was sort of our rationale for doing it, and trying, I think, in a way that draws lessons from both parts. The human rights chapter is on a relatively obscure British lawyer named Peter Benenson, who in 1961 wrote an op-ed called The Forgotten Prisoners in the Observer, what we would call today going viral. Basically launched Amnesty International within a few years. It grew over the course of the 1960s. He also was he was an odd duck. He was forced out of the organization by about 1967 because the kind of skills he had weren't there for consolidating and expanding, institutionalizing. And I use them not just for themselves, but to show how they seeded, SEEDED, the contemporary human rights movement, and in many ways seeded CEDED leadership. We now have an array of groups, and the role of human rights groups in the 21st century on these issues is crucial. I mean, the Rohingya is a great example, where the revelations of the genocide did not come from any government, but they came from investigative journalists and groups like Human Rights Watch that now had satellite technology that could demonstrate what was going on the ground. And so Benenson, it just is an example of that. The last section on sustainability has a chapter on Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, for her international role. She chaired in the late 1980s it's a UN commission, not official, but sanctioned by the UN, kind of like the Gareth Evans Commission that did Responsibility to Protect years later, on sustainable development, which, if you recall, at the time was a big North-South issue. A lot of opposition in the South. When you mean sustainable development is to keep us down. We can't do what you guys did. to develop, and manage the politics of that in a way that really launched conceptions of sustainable development. We now have in the Sustainable Development Goals lots of scholarly and policy research on what sustainable development is. Went on to run the WHO, World Health Organization, in the 90s, did major reforms there, applied it to the SARS epidemic, one of the first contemporary major global pandemics, got the anti-tobacco treaty passed, major multilateral treaty. And then the other chapter is on the Gates Foundation. Again, trying to get at statesmanship from non-state actors, I call philanthropy statesmanship, takes into account critics of Gates. It's really on their global health work. They have the second largest budget in the world today for global health next to the WHO. And it played a very huge role in a lot of issues, and opens up the question of the kind of statesmanship we may want to have, need to have from philanthropy statesmanship as well. So that's the lessons. And again, in each area, I try to draw out lessons for the freedom and human rights agenda, for the politics of identity agenda. And let me just illustrate that with two of the cases really quickly, and then I'll open it up. So the Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, U.S.-China opening case. I got to interview Kissinger for the book, and most of the documents on this are declassified. You can read Winston Lord's memorandums of conversation, a variety of other studies that have been done. And, any of us who've done these interviews, you don't go in and say, "Can you tell me exactly what you said, in that particular conversation?" But you ask for the color. And the first question I asked him was, in the very first meeting in July 1971, there's a note that says you extended your hand and you shook hands. Can you tell me more about that? Because I'd heard some versions, and it was a really interesting story. This is about statesmanship. So in 1955, at the Geneva Convention, dividing up Southeast Asia after the end of French colonialism, it was John Foster Dulles, Molotov, and Zhou Enlai. And Dulles, the super Cold War hawk, shook hands with Molotov, but he wouldn't shake hands with Zhou Enlai. This was Red China, right? I remember growing up, and there's a degree of racism in this. And even though it was the Soviets that had the nuclear weapons and were our geopolitical adversary around the world, Red China was a different story. And so some of the China experts on Kissinger's staff, he did give them credit, said it really would be important to do this. And later in the transcripts, there's a conversation, and he talked more about this in the interview, about Zhou Enlai saying, "You have no idea how much that meant to me. It meant respect. It was the basis for trying to build trust in the relationship." And what you saw here that, in terms of a couple of takeaways that I think were really significant, one was sort of running against the conventional wisdom in diplomacy. They made the transactional serve the transformation. That both sides went in with a crucial transactional issue. Vietnam for us, Taiwan for them. We wanted the Chinese to really sit on the North Vietnamese. The Soviets weren't. And they really wanted us to go much further than we did on Taiwan. The Chinese agreed to reduce their aid to North Vietnam, but not necessarily to pressure them to come to the peace table. We accepted less than we necessarily wanted on the transaction. We made the One China statement, but it took another 7, 8 years to normalize relations with China and end them with Taiwan. There's a quote from Zhou Enlai in the transcript in which he says, "Only the settlement of fundamental questions first can lead to the settlement of other questions." And I thought that was really interesting. When you think about building relations among adversaries, you can't just go in and say, "Hey, we trust each other, let's go forward." But I think in some respects it makes the transactional easier because you realize there's a basis of you're moving towards a degree of a shared strategic view. You're moving towards a degree of trust in the relationship. And rather than our classic, I know when I've been in the State Department, we would give, when I was working for Secretary Clinton, she'd go off with her deliverables and her asks, right? And, you got to have some of that. You got to tell press and the president what you've achieved. But in some respects, the whole, especially in adversarial or relationships that have big problems, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think this really has lessons for lots of relationships. When I wrote a piece about Kim Jong-un, one of the arguments I made was, that it's not just going to be about, there has to be, you have to get to the transformational. You really have to have a conception of where this relationship is leading. And our inability to do that thus far, in fact, has led to one side saying, tell me at the beginning you'll do everything in denuclearization and you'll get the benefits at the end. And the other side saying, there's got to be some step-by-step, process where steps lead to benefits along the way. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about as we think about statesmanship. Second thing was the way the breakthrough happens, it's my other alliteration, 3 Ps, was the personal, the policy, and the political. They spent 17 hours of meetings in the first July session. Some were with aides, most were one-on-one with translators. And the second trip, 4 days, 10 meetings, 23 hours and 40 minutes. Think about this in our scripted summits and talking points. Kissinger actually when we met, was his criticism of the Obama-Xi meeting in Sunnyvale in 2013 was it was all scripted, that you really needed, Reagan and Gorbachev actually did this. And it allowed Reagan in some ways to resist the Richard Pearls and others in his administration, and Gorbachev as well. Leaders really need, some ability to talk about a variety of things in a serious way. And this notion of everything's scripted, everything's talking points, when you're trying to transform a relationship, it doesn't help you establish the personal dimension that's really crucial. The policy needs to be strategized. Yes, there were conducive conditions. There was the merging strategic triangle with the Soviets. There were the confrontations that the Chinese and the Soviets had along the border. But converting that to a breakthrough really took a lot of policy strategizing. And it's why I focus on Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. When it comes to the politics, Nixon and Mao get a lot of credit. They got the opera. And Kissinger and Zhou Enlai couldn't have done it on their own. So it really was the personal policy and the political that led to it. And you really need all 3 elements in these relationships. My own view as someone who supported, I was in the administration, the JCPOA, but I supported it. The conversation I had was, it dealt with an immediate issue, but even before Trump and, leaving the JCPOA, ultimately you weren't going to be able to make progress in the U.S.-Iranian relationship with just that one leg. You were going to have to try to get at the transformational. If you couldn't, you were going to have problem maintaining it even if a Donald Trump hadn't come along. And so there are a lot of interesting lessons here about how to manage relations. Let me just say a word about Hammarskjöld, and then I'm going to stop. He becomes Secretary General, the second Secretary General in the history of the UN. His predecessor called it the most impossible job in the world. He was seen as a nice Scandinavian diplomat, bureaucrat, doesn't make waves. And I use 3 case studies in the book. One is on this prisoner exchange that he engineers with China on U.S. prisoners of war taken in the Korean War. Second is Suez, and the third is the Congo, which ultimately leads to his death in plane crash, which was written off as an accident, and the investigation has once again been reopened as to whether or not it was not an accident but an assassination. The first story is actually really interesting, and it's a little less well known. So, there were 2 Americans that had been taken POWs during the Korean War by the PRC, and were being put on trial for espionage military tribunals. Huge explosive potential. You've got, John Foster Dulles. You've got China that's not even allowed to be a member of the UN. And Hammarskjöld dives into this, makes a trip to Beijing, first trip ever to a capital by a Secretary General, kind of negotiates back and forth, gets this relationship going, meets with Zhou Enlai, and then there's this great exchange in which he goes back to Sweden in 1955 to relax on the coast for his 50th birthday, and he gets a cable from China, or he gets a message from his ambassador wishing him a happy birthday from the Chinese and asking what he might like for a birthday present. And he says, release of the American prisoners. And 3 days later, a cable comes back from the Swedish ambassador to China that says, quote, the Chinese government has decided to release the imprisoned U.S. flyers. This release from serving the full term takes place in order to maintain friendship with Hammarskjöld and has no connection to the UN resolution, which the U.S. had pushed through, which was very anti-China. Zhou Enlai expresses hope that Hammarskjöld will take note of this point, and Zhou Enlai congratulates Hammarskjöld on his 50th birthday. We use these vehicles in diplomacy, and it didn't happen just by happenstance. The Suez Crisis, as one people may know more, But Hammarskjöld dives into it. You had four crucial issues that came together. You had anti-colonialism, you had the Arab-Israeli conflict, you had the Cold War, Khrushchev and the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower actually was smart enough to give Hammarskjöld some running room by then, even though Dulles wasn't very happy. Khrushchev was up and on. And you had the legitimacy of the Security Council. Two permanent members, Britain and France, along with Israel, invaded another country. Hammarskjöld is the one that conducts the diplomacy directly with Nasser, with all sides, gets the withdrawal of British and French forces, Israeli. He and Lester Pearson, who wins the Nobel Peace Prize, the Canadian ambassador and foreign minister, create the first major UN peacekeeping force and resolves this conflict. At the same time, Hungary's going on. When you look at Hammarskjöld's schedule, pretty amazing schedule he's keeping in that period of October 1956. But he's wise enough to know that he can work this issue, and not necessarily the Hungary one, because the Hungary one is a perceived vital interest of a major power, and sees the difference. My own view is, I know the political problems, but unless we have a Hammarskjöldian Secretary General of the 21st century, it's not the only thing the UN needs. But number one, it's crucial to an effective UN. There's no organization that operates effectively without it. And secondly, while it's quote unquote politically unrealistic, we had a president who gave a speech on sovereignty, and I remember the days of Jesse Helms and others that, we don't do that in the United States, and Russia bows its head to the UN but doesn't want anything in Ukraine, and China says don't meet with the Dalai Lama, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that for the major powers, precisely for the issues that affect its interests, and the ones that it can't and doesn't want to do, unless the UN has a more significant role in at least some of them, our own interests as major powers are going to be negatively affected. And while you might give up some prerogative, the policy gains you make are great. Now, I know that's a hard argument to make politically, but as I sort of close, as I think about the 21st century agenda and a lot of the issues that we deal with, part of the point of the book is, if we go about most of these issues as business as usual, we're not going to get the breakthroughs we need. Not on the emerging tensions between major powers, not a new Cold War in my view, but serious tensions, not on effective international institutions, not on a variety of those. And so we need to push, I think, in a pragmatic and still realistic way for lessons from the 20th century that can help us in the 21st. And that's kind of what I try to do, in this book. In the end of recognizing the difficulties, looking at the possibilities, and stressing the necessity. So why don't I stop there and open it up, and we'll take it however people want to go. Thank you.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much. That's quite I'm tempted, there's so much in there, I'm tempted to ask you about specific people in your account. Obviously we always sort of go like moths to the sun, right, to Kissinger for some reason. But actually, I'm going to ask you in a way, a kind of, I don't know, this is sort of a dirty pool question, because it's sort of maybe the hardest one, but it relates to this idea that there are crucial moments where flawed people can do things against big problems. I guess that's what we're talking about. But I wonder if you can look at that in negative terms as well. And then extrapolate to the question of, well, does it really matter in the end? We just had this UN or this, I guess, sort of meta data or meta report surveyed by scientists convened by the UN that said we have until, I didn't know how long we have, but in 2040 things are going to become dire, if I read the headlines correctly, in terms of climate change, or possibly dire. Now, you could say that the role of one election and one person in U.S. history can make that even more dire, because let's say we have another 6 years of the Trump presidency without any American leadership on this issue. On the other hand, you could say that just reflects my own personality-focused naivete, that it's actually too difficult for an international community to deal with something like this anyway, that there are actually structural issues and sort of a global prisoner's dilemma that makes this all impossible. So, as I say, it's sort of almost the most difficult question, and maybe unfair to the sort of nitty-gritty of your book, but what do you think?
No, it's a highly fair question. Let me answer a couple aspects of it. So, it's interesting. One of the sources of the idea originally to write this book was an article that Dan Byman and Ken Pollack wrote on kind of bad guy leaders, in which they argued that if you look at Germany at the end of World War I, there's no question it's going to be unstable. But the particular form the instability took had a heck of a lot to do with the leader that emerged, Hitler. Other leaders could have emerged of an unstable, even aggressive Germany. Might have been the same. And they made the same argument about the French Revolution and Napoleon. And I was thinking about this, and I started to flip that around to the
Right.
positive side. And I think as we look at the world today, and social psychologists will always say that it's easier to appeal to people's fear than hope. So, there's a heck of a lot of advantages. Clearly, it's something to do with the Brexit vote. A heck of a lot to do with our election. It's happening in lots of places in the world. It's named Brazil is the most recent one, and that's a real issue. Okay, but I also think that some of the difficulties that you're stressing, if you picked up a newspaper from any one of these issues, whether it was apartheid or the Israeli conflict when Rabin's coming to power, or Red China. We would have seen as ominous kind of headlines as we see today about our things. And I think we have to put it in perspective, not to say, okay, something will happen, but to not overstate the difficulty of today. The breakthroughs I talk about as breakthroughs that, number one, avoided very real possibilities of things being worse in the moment, Suez leading to a war, what would happen U.S.-China, the Cold War coming out differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But breakthroughs only create new opportunities. They demonstrate that substantial progress can happen, and then you can have backlashes and backsliding, or you can build on that progress, right? So the climate change, I thought about writing a chapter about my old boss Al Gore, but I felt a conflict of interest there. And part of that, by the way, would have been about political failure, because Al never translated it to political success, but was writing about this in 1989, and others were too. And so we've missed enormous opportunities there. I'm not convinced that nothing can be done. I'm really not. I think that there are political difficulties, even if you look at some policies where countries are starting to calculate the costs of conversion, say, from coal, this has happened a little bit in China's calculation, are now greater than the cost of the public health costs of just using coal unabated. You begin to see changes. It's very difficult. I don't know how we can say it's impossible to solve, because other things have been resolved. And secondly, if we say that, what are we, resigning ourselves to? So, I've been around the block too many times, many scars on my back to be naive, but I do think you have to keep pushing for opportunities to break through. The U.S. policy now is an enormous backslide. There's no question about it, and it's a classic example of the kind of transition. What the Ipcc put out the other day is pretty overwhelming, right? What would have to happen in terms of change? If you go back to Rio and other things, that were doable. So you have to figure those things out. Some of it is mitigation. Some of it is reduction. So, I just think that there's no perfection, but there's not a problem we face today that I think you say automatically is worse than problems that countries and the global community have faced in other eras in which at least some substantial progress was made.
Good. Well, that's the answer one would have wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Well, I'm opening the floor. You have the whole 20th century to swim into, so who would like to go first? Ben Berry.
I work here. How important do you think are negotiators who can actually knock heads together? A lot of what you've talked about has been about statesmen on either side. The ace negotiator you identified was Hammarskjöld. An example is that you could argue for the end of the war in Bosnia, the planet fell aligned to make negotiations at Dayton possible.
Right.
But I personally think it's a bit of an insult that Richard Holbrooke didn't get a Nobel Peace Prize for his decisive role in effectively barnstorming the three warring factions into submission to a peace deal. Similarly, I often wonder about the Northern Ireland conflict, whether actually Blair and his team's importance in creating the irreversible momentum in the negotiations has been underestimated.
No, I totally agree. And in the Northern Ireland case, I don't bring in George Mitchell and others, Blair, because I wanted to make a point, about just for that, cutting into it from that slice. And I talk about the rest, but I just wanted to bring out that point of where civil society made a difference. So Holbrooke, in many respects, fits, personality, strategy, capacity. Again, diplomacy is strategy, not just process. And so do others. These were teams. And while I emphasize the individual, there's a lot of aspects of teams. In the Oslo process, there are Norwegians that play a role. Despite the Rabin-Peres tensions, Peres plays a role, some others do too. And, it always gets handed over to the major players at a certain point. Even the Kissinger Joe Online negotiations had some preludes happening in Poland and elsewhere, quietly. So I think that's extremely important. And part of it is to get us thinking about diplomacy as strategy, right? I do push back when it becomes, well, we just need to talk. Well, if you talk, and, I've been doing some work lately on thinking about where the, beyond this book, that, what's the, my view is liberal order was in trouble long before Trump and Brexit, and the underperformance of international institutions, and saying that people that actually believe in international institutions have to do a tough love so that we can figure out how to make them better. Otherwise, it's not that you fall into the John Bolton or John Mearsheimer camp necessarily about them, but I think you really have to figure out how to make them more effective. And so all of that is about diplomatic strategy. And I know I was out at the Foreign Service Institute. We have another name. We used to call it the Schultz Center, I guess now. And to say we're talking to them about some curricular reform. I wish that in our training of diplomats, speaking for the U.S. now, we took strategy as seriously as the military does. And I don't think we do that enough. There are other reasons we have a real human capital problem going to the Foreign Service, even before Trump, but especially with what's been happening there. But it's absolutely crucial. And even on the transactional diplomacy, the day-to-day kind of things. But on the ones I'm focusing on, you really have to have, all these people had. That's why I say I'm not convinced that other leaders in these positions would have succeeded where they succeeded.
Corey Shaki.
I'm Corey Shaki, the Deputy Director here at the IISS. I want to enthusiastically support the point that you just made about teaching strategy to diplomats. I run a unscientific test of this. I have never met a military officer who didn't have an informed view and give me a good argument on Lee's tactics at Chancellorsville versus his Union counterparts, right? You have a really fun, it's a professional development conversation. And yet we spend all of our resources training American diplomats to speak languages in a country where people actually are native speakers of very many different languages. And we don't teach them to have an interesting conversation about whether Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, or John Adams was a better minister to Paris during the Revolutionary War. Probably the most important diplomatic negotiation the United States was ever engaged in.
Right.
So I love it that you are emphasizing the importance of strategy rather than process. I'd like to draw you out a little bit, though, on the people who aren't statesmen. Because Dana is a very interesting example of climate change. I think can be carried further in the direction of your book, which is that despite the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, the overt hostility of the federal government, Antonio Guterres said it's likely the United States is going to be the first country that meets its Paris Climate Accord goals because Jerry Brown, the governor of the great Golden State of California, Michael Bloomberg, a private citizen who's willing to fund private efforts, the Tim Cook, the head of Apple Computers, and many other private citizens are driving that. Right. So tell us more about the civil society aspects of it, because I think it's increasingly important.
I totally agree with you, and I think so. The climate change is a great example. Tim Cook's a good Duke alum, I must say. And so it's beneficial that people like that as your alum. Melinda French Gates is also a Duke alum, so some of those things help university. So there are other examples. So Bill Gates has actually set up a big venture fund, with money for sustainable investment. I know of another big venture fund that's actually based here in London and in New York that was actually set up. I don't want to do this as an advertisement, but it's an example. It's called Generation Investment Management, and it was set up by former head of Goldman Sachs named David Blood and Al Gore. And of course, the Financial Times, when they set it up, called it Blood and Gore, right? For over 10, 15 years now, they've been investing in using big pools of money, pension funds, university endowments, other sorts of things, and investing in sustainable companies at the company level, right? And they define sustainability broadly, not just climate. And they have managed to beat the Dow and do this as well. And so it fit. And so there's been all these efforts. The conference that Chicago Council of Ivo Daalder runs that's been bringing together leaders of cities. And one of the big focuses has been, what can we do about climate change? What can we learn from each other, right? Even if London did, I don't know enough about it to say how successful, but the congestion, even if it's perfectly successful, doesn't mean it can be successful in New York. You have to, like comparative studies, draw out lessons. And we're seeing a lot of that. And I think it's great. The problem is that it's only compensatory to make up for the problems states are creating, right? The same with the Gates Foundation and global health. It's really been, the WHO went in the other direction after Gro Brundtland in terms of its, it was having its budget cut by member states, and so it had no resources, so it lost lots of its experts to elsewhere. If we can get to a point where the civil society and the private sector can be additive to what states are doing, so that states may not sufficiently do climate change, then we have a really nice public-private nonprofit sector combination for major problems the world faces. And I think it's conducive to some more than others. So I think, global health, human rights, climate change, probably some issues about reforming globalization, in ways that are needed. I haven't been a believer, and I don't think you are either, in the notion that economic independence can lead to, sufficiently lead to improvement in relations among major powers to avoid their conflicts, right? Yeah, World War I, right? So I think it's important that there are trade relations between the United States and China. I mean, right now they've complicated things in some crazy ways, including that American companies have interests that are not necessarily the same as the Trump administration. So I don't take it into, that's why I have my 5 domains, and so it really plays into some domains more than others. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, I remember the Clinton administration started something called Builders for Peace that was a Jewish American and Arab American investors trying to get them to go in West Bank and Gaza. And, it was a compliment, but it couldn't make up for the problems that got created. So that's where it's interesting to look at different sectors of the global agenda and to try to get out of a little bit less compensatory and more additive for these other actors.
Gordon.
Gordon Barris, a member of the Institute. I think when one looks at the 21st century, the structure of it and the issues we're facing are rather different from those of the 20th century. I mean, many people would, certainly some observers, would notice that there are really 4 main groupings that are going to have the major impact: the United States, China, Russia, and Europe, whatever that may be. And the question is that, given how each of these entities can do something that will have a knock-on effect elsewhere, and the increasing complexity of the use of economic levers to influence the judgments of others, I just wonder what your reflections are about the way in what sort of leadership, what sort of approaches are appropriate to this changing environment.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We like when the U.S. issued its national security strategy at the end of last year and went back to a major powers focus. To me, this era is a mix of, if you will, the 19th century, major power rivalries and competition. I don't think it's a new Cold War, in terms of U.S.-Russia. It's not ideological, it's not global, and it's not the brink of nuclear wars, but it's a major power rival. So we've got a mix of that, and at the same time, I think to a greater extent than other eras, we have the intra-state issue. So in the Cold War, to generalize, what we saw a lot was the U.S.-Soviet competition being internalized into the issues in the third world. Complicating lines that are there in Latin America, Africa, Asia. In the 21st century, I think what we're seeing is the externalization of internal conflicts. Syria, refugees, Europe. And, not in here, but in some of my other writing, I call this what they call there was this commercial on American TV that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But what happens inside states doesn't stay inside states. I refer to it as the Vegas dilemma. So we have both going on. So it's really not, even if we could get those four entities around a table, a la, the Concert of Europe or the Bismarck Conference, it wouldn't be sufficient, right? Because we have this other dimension, which does make it, I think, distinct from other eras. At the same time, I don't think it makes the lessons of other eras irrelevant, because there are things that are not necessarily absolutely based upon, configurations. When, U.S. and China are trying to work out the relationship, I don't think what Kissinger and Zhou Enlai were trying to do, I think it was really about how do you work with two adversarial powers who have an ideological as well as other conflict in China. And I think that you can learn a lesson from that and apply it. The other point of this is, some people often ask that question in relation to media and social media. And so let me just quickly read you a passage here that relates to that. And maybe you can guess who wrote it and when it was written. For our everyday life is becoming so saturated with the tremendous power of mass communications. Our political life is becoming so expensive, so mechanized, and so dominated by professional politicians and public relations men that the idealist who dreams of independent statesmanship is rudely awakened by the necessity of election and conflict. Anybody want to venture to guess who or when that was written?
Probably around the time of Walter Lippmann or something.
Yeah, it was John Kennedy Profiles in Courage, right? Not say he totally adopted, but it says 1956, and there's lamentations about costs in media, and of course social media is different. But I keep seeing these things as different species of the same genus, right? And the challenge is really to figure out, as opposed to totally different genus. And that's kind of the way I think about, the great questions we face. I mean, I do think we're going through a period that's in some ways like after 1945, where the big questions about what international order looks like are reopened in a big way. They're not just a little fine-tuning of what we thought was this wonderful liberal order.
And I think it's not talking about trying to reestablish a quote liberal international order, again, whatever that really means. It's trying to think of relationships that will give a degree of stability to a complex relationship. It's not necessarily so much a question of being able to resolve these issues.
Exactly.
That may take decades in some cases, but anything that can stop this quadripartite grouping, generate more problems than is necessary, would be welcome, I think.
Yeah, I think of it as like, as you economists think of currency fluctuations, you try to keep them within a band. And I think if you can keep major power relations fluctuating within a band, you're not going to get a straight line. And so even on China, I know you guys have had sessions on this, the whole responsible stakeholder thing, of course the argument is, you're telling me to be responsible, you guys haven't been that responsible either, and not just under Trump. And stakeholder, they actually, want to say in what they're holding a stake in, right? So if anything emerges, there's going to be a hybrid international economic regime, I think. And there'll be arguments on both sides and how you work that out, and whether it's some's a negotiation or some other. So we really are in a very different era than just the old notion that the liberal order was going to go forward. I mean, some of that is like the end of history, where why would we think that an order that was created 70 plus years ago on a particular distribution of power, international agenda, other factors in the international system, even if you argue that it was good, unlike, say, Patrick Porter, who argues that it was bad at the beginning, but even if you argue that it was good, why would you think it necessarily fits a world that's very different 70 years ago? It doesn't make sense, right? Now, it doesn't mean you throw it all out, but it is a little different than just some colleagues' notions of rules-based order. What are those rules? And they, of course, they'll be different because you have a world that has changed somewhat significantly in 70 years. And I think that's where and I don't profess to have the answer to that, but those are the right questions, as opposed to, well, how do we go back to the way it was before the events of the elections of 2016.
Malcolm.
Following on from that, in a way, given the disbelief, well, on the part of Trump and Bolton on one hand, and in a different way probably of the Putin regime, in the whole concept of rules-based order and international treaties, etc., and the actual attitude to these things, with the things that we would say were differently positive, shall we say, and I accept that changes have to be made. What prospects do you see for the non-proliferation treaty and for the future of trying to get arms reductions? What can we look forward to in the near future?
I think that the lessons of pulling out of the JCPOA and pending the outcome of the North Korea, if that's not positive, I think that those two huge setbacks for any prospects for sustaining the non-proliferation regime. There's always been this tension between the commitments made by the nuclear arms holders back in 1967, 68, and arms reductions. And on the other hand, I think that, if the 5 of the 6, if the other members of the JCPOA can find ways to sustain it and the Iranians continue to largely comply, and if we can find a way of negotiating down the North Korea agreement, the North Korea nuclear arms, negotiating down, I'm not sure you ever fully eliminate it. I think you could have some momentum, not just for sitting down in a large room about the non-proliferation treaty, but for non-proliferation as a norm and a strategy. But if we don't have those, what are the incentives for countries, right, to do that? The Libya case is kind of an example too, and I think that's been distorted a bit. I mean, I think that the deal that was struck largely by the British, the Americans too, in 2003. There were actually some lessons there that I don't think were totally nullified by the 2011 military intervention. So I think that's where the important issues are, more than whenever the next conference is of the UN group.
Let me, we're almost out of time. Let me ask one last question. Since you've written a book about that also has to do with personalities, I mean, it has the interaction between person and history, but I was struck by your early emphasis that few, if any, of these people were saints. And I wonder if there's anything in particular you've learned from looking at all of them this way, and in a certain sense worrying about that. I don't know if you're worried about it, but
there are qualities that I do identify, and there are a couple that I think are important. One I call personal capital. In some cases, it's a moral capital that Mandela has, that an Aung San Suu Kyi had. A courage, a commitment to the cause at personal cost that leads people to think that you have a great authenticity. Sometimes the personal capital is more the prestige that you're larger than the position you hold, which is kind of what a Kissinger had, what Dag Hammarskjöld gained over time. So I think that personal capital is important, extremely important. Second thing is the ability to learn over time. So Rabin goes from Minister of Defense, whose expression in the first Intifada was break the knuckles, break the wrists, to someone who, as he said often, there is no guarantee that peace will bring security to Israel, but there is no way Israel will have security without peace. Which, by the way, if you talk to folks from the military and the Mossad and the Shin Bet, you hear more often than not, as opposed to the armchair strategists. So the ability to learn. Mandela learned. He gave up, the violent cause. The ability for a leader to learn over time through experience, which is different than flip-flopping. And two others. One is really important. It's to have a vision, a conception combined with a political strategy. And the vision, talk about in the book, as having analytic, prescriptive, and normative elements. The analytic tells people what's wrong with the present. The prescriptive tells them where you want to take them, and not so much in a giant bullet-pointed PowerPoint, but a general sense. But the normative is tricky. That's like understanding that, there's a quote from Machiavelli about how dangerous change is. Change is scary for people. It produces anxiety. And so how do you normatively link it to some values that are even traditional values that give them a degree of security as they try to move forward? So, for example, this was a failing of Gorbachev and Rabin. Gorbachev lost sight of that at home. Rabin lost sight of it at home and led to assassination. So you have to have, and that's a very tricky balance to strike. And then it has to be combined with political strategy. You have to know how to get from point A to point B, and your political strategy may be managing the array of groups in your country, and maybe you're managing the external audiences, that you have. Lech Walesa did a very good job of getting some insurance through his global visibility. Aung San Suu Kyi actually did the same thing, and others. Gandhi actually did that for a while too, much to the consternation of Churchill. So those are some of the things: personal capital, ability to learn, a sense of a vision combined with a political strategy that are fairly broad, but they kind of work, and which is also why I'm not, and that can that can be developed over time. Frankly, it's very different than, to put this in political context, consultants always have their checklist of who's going to be the right presidential. We're going through that now, and doesn't quite fit my framework, but just there's another example of where that doesn't work is if you look at both Trump and Bernie Sanders, who almost won against great odds, neither one fit consultants' checklists. Go back to the 1980s. I remember John Glenn was the perfect presidential candidate, American hero, astronaut, and he didn't go anywhere. So anyway, those are the frameworks I think that lead to the kind of leadership that can produce the changes I'm talking about. So,
Well, great. I mean, that's glad I asked the question because it's was a very rich and an interesting answer. And that brings us to the exact hour mark. So I think this was a great presentation.